Welcome, everybody. I'm pleased to be introducing you to my former roommate, former flatmate, and fellow alumnus of the City University of New York Graduate Center PhD program in philosophy, Michał Klincewicz. Michał is primarily located in the Netherlands. He's an assistant professor at Tilburg University in the School of Digital Humanities, and in particular in the Department of Cognitive Science and Artificial Intelligence. He also has an appointment as an assistant professor at Jagiellonian University in Krakow, in Poland, in the Department of Cognitive Science. Michał, thank you so much for your time and your expertise.
Thank you so much for having me, Mark. I'm delighted to be here.
It's been a long time. I think you helped me move into the apartment in Harlem in 2006, if I recall correctly, and there were people doing crack on the stoop.
Should we be recording this, Mark?
I didn't name any names.
Yes, it was it was also a methadone clinic across the street, and numerous drug busts and shootings. Yes, Harlem back then was a little bit different.
Right, and at that time you were working a bit in industry, or you had just recently finished working in industry in computer science. So you've got like a background both in philosophy and cognitive science and artificial intelligence and in industry. Can you tell us a little bit about like how you got to where you are and what insights you've gleaned along the way?
That's a very deep question, Mark, and I don't want to go into too much details about my life story, but yes, I started as a computer scientist, as a programmer, and I finished in 2002 in New York in Pace University, and went off to work for a sort of a small startup place. And perhaps because of what was going on in New York at the time, post 9/11, it was kind of hard for me to find my place there in the culture. I simultaneously applied to PhD programs, and one of my other degrees was in philosophy, so I applied to those as well. I got into CUNY, among other places, and that's how I ended up doing it. And I stuck with it, but continued working as a programmer, kind of an architect mostly, with my own company. I started a consulting business that put me through the hard knocks of CUNY without having to sell my kidney, which is what some of us had to do to pay rent and get a PhD in philosophy in New York City at the time. So, but then I stopped. And by the time I got to the dissertation stage, this job I have now in Tilburg is kind of a return back into the fold of that. In that I am working again with computer scientists. I've taught some programming courses, but also work closely with industry. So in particular right now, with the Port of Rotterdam and some gaming.
That's great. Well, so one of the topics that we're addressing in this course that I'm interviewing you for is like AI ethics, AI epistemology, AI policy, I guess, just normative issues around artificial intelligence. And there's a lot of hype around AI, as I guess you know. But one of the main kind of techniques that seems to be most promising is the use of neural networks and Markov chains. And I'm wondering how these tools are related to stuff that you're doing, stuff in, say, facial recognition technologies, image recognition more generally, and so on?
Well, they're tools, they're algorithms, and some of them are good at some things and not so good at others. So the things that I'm working on together with my team here in Tilburg, and mostly the PhD student really that I'm working with, is indeed a kind of deep learning, where deep learning can involve neural networks, but it's really a more general kind of term meant to describe a kind of learning where there's more than one hidden layer in the network. It's not completely supervised how that ends up looking, and those kinds of algorithms and those kinds of techniques are particularly good at facial recognition and image recognition tasks. So classification in particular. So in our work, what we care about are expressions of mental states, you could say, right? So whether they be emotions or thoughts or decisions that may manifest themselves in behavior of the face. So either changes in expressions or blanks or and typically that kind of work has been done in cognitive psychology with the use of things like eye tracking or and what deep learning and in particular convolutional neural networks allow you to do is to do this online without a lab. Yeah, using as little as a webcam, perhaps, and with relatively good fault toleration. So you don't have to worry whether someone is putting their hand over their face or, yeah. I mean, of course, it depends how you train the network. You have to make sure that it's not biased and so on. But they perform really well, and outside of the lab. That's why we use it.
So that's really cool stuff, but I wonder, like, so how fine grained is it? So can you use it to say like someone is thinking of a red apple versus a green apple?
No.
Yeah.
I mean, at least I hope that's not going to happen anytime soon. I mean, these are pretty coarse-grained psychological categories and not content.
So it's not getting you the content of the attitude, it's getting you which type of attitude.
Yeah, that's a nice philosophical way of putting it. That's right. So
like you might be angry at the red apple, angry at the green apple, angry at Vladimir Putin, and those are all the same.
You could be, yes. I mean, it's, I don't remember who it is that said this, it's probably someone like Wittgenstein or Plato or something, but face is window to the soul or whatever. And I think that there's a lot that goes on in the face that is indicative of what's going on in the mind. And importantly for us, it happens sometimes outside of conscious control. Yeah. So
right. So like famously, the Duchenne smile is like hard to fake and also hard to suppress, right?
That's right. And these are exactly the sorts of things, and this is how fine-grained it can indeed get, that a well-trained machine learning, deep learning network could pick up, I'm sure.
So to what extent do you rely on like a basic emotions framework? Is it, are you thinking like fear, joy, disgust, anger, surprise, that's what we get? Or is it more like there's a whole range?
Yeah, I mean,
dimensional?
I think ideally, when you're doing something like the convolution, or when doing something with AI, you may not want to start with some preconceived idea of which features are going to be relevant. And you would like especially in a deep learning model, you'd want that to come out on its own, so to speak, and not bias what's going to be doing the work of classifying, say, when someone is in this state or that. So if you have a lot of data, you may not want to start with these basic emotions. But if you have less data, or you kind of have some idea about what you're looking for, I think you may start with these basic ones. In context of facial expressions, however, the thing that I think a lot of people care about and use is the Paul Ekman kind of inspired work on facial, the facts. I don't know, it's facial action units. Yeah. So where you can sort of identify some of the compound movements and muscles of the face as being indicative, together with others, of particular types of expressions. So surprise, for example, maybe the raising of the eyebrows, and together with jaw drop, and each one of these behaviors will be some kind of an action unit. But you know, the Ekman had an idea about how those map onto the emotions. All right, whether this was the right idea, you know, or whether some of these pull into other categories is a little bit controversial. And I think that we today have a much broader understanding of what emotional states are like and how they may relate to those expressions than he did back in the day. And machine learning and the sort of work that we're doing, I think, is a part of that process, because we sort of get to find out, for example, that, you know, certain expressions in the chin have so far been indicative for us of tension and stress. Which is kind of a surprising finding, right? And you're not gonna, I think, find that immediately in Ekman, at least I haven't so far.
Right. So the idea is that you can get some inspiration maybe from this stuff from a few decades ago, but then you move further along.
Well, you can use the action units as features, right? Because you're going to know that a lot of faces are going to behave more or less the same way, right? They have the same facial muscles, unless something is wrong. So yeah, you can kind of treat them as features and bias your models to find them or to extract them in some way. But how they combine together to indicate some kind of a mental state, or how they correlate with a mental state, I think you let the AI do the work for you. You don't want to sort of antecedently expect that.
Right. I mean, so I guess one of the questions that is coming up in this class that I'm teaching is like, at what level is facial recognition or facial analysis working? So there's like, you can unlock your phone with your face. So that's supposed to be uniquely identifying to an individual. There's stuff about classifying people's attitudes, like emotions or other attitudes, as you've just been saying. There's also use of like facial analysis to classify people as belonging to different demographic groups. So some of this stuff is really controversial, like using AI to say whether someone is straight or gay, whether they're Korean or Han Chinese or Uyghur, whether they're inclined to aggress against the police officer whose camera is pointed at them. I wonder, which of these sorts of uses you think is technologically supported? Like, could you actually make that inference? And also like morally and politically defensible, like, should we be doing this even if it is the sort of thing that we can think is reliable?
Yeah, okay. So the state of the art in facial recognition, to my knowledge, is such that it's extremely good already. And so faces are a very multidimensional kind of image, but they're relatively stable in that they have features that most faces have, you know, two eyes and a nose and etc. But the variance is kind of where you get the differences, right? So someone might have a nose that's a little bit smaller, a little bit bigger, and eyes are a little bit further apart or closer, or lids are there like this or like that. You can represent these things with points, and then the distances between the points are going to capture something unique about the face. If you have a billion of these things, it's not hard to then classify or to even find a unique feature for each face, because there will be some kind of a integral of all these differences. Whatever differences exist between faces that are really similar to each other are going to pop out really well if you have a lot of data that was used to train the model. So my answer to your first question about the technological feasibility of things like facial expression detection or facial unique facial identification, I think that this technology is already here. And whether it's used or how it's used, that I think is a little bit of an empirical question. I know you know of some reports from law enforcement in places like China, for example, where this stuff is used on a regular basis, right? And the accuracy there is pretty high. But maybe the question is, what do you know about this that I don't? Because it seems to me that most people assume that this stuff is already here, except it's not here, meaning say in Australia or in the Netherlands, but that's not because it's not technologically feasible to do.
I mean, so it's here in Australia. Clearview AI was recently embroiled in a controversy here, as they were in the UK and the United States. So I'm not suggesting that it's just like pie in the sky kind of stuff that people are dreaming about. But I guess I wonder how well these algorithms can actually be trained, because it seems like, you know, if you give it lots of data about a certain subclass of the population, then it'll be good at them and it'll be bad at everybody else, for one thing.
Sure.
So, and that seems to be what has happened in many cases. But like the normative question, I guess, is the one that I'm even more interested in. Like, should we be doing this to people? And are these algorithms actually sensitive to the things that matter and will matter in 10 years? So like the gay or not algorithm was trained on people's social media and dating profile photos. So it was not just like their face, it was like whether they had earrings on, whether they were wearing makeup, whether they had a hat on, all that kind of stuff. And it'll even be sensitive, as I guess I'm sure you know, to like the resolution of the photo. So if I take a selfie with like a high resolution recent camera, that's going to make a difference to, so like class, socioeconomic class is going to get coded in via resolution. So
Okay.
on the one hand, you're saying like
I see.
they're really good at this, but like also,
Yeah, I see where you're going with this, and maybe, you know, so the thing I said about the points, yeah, I think that's where the magic happens. The magic happens with these kinds of algorithms, specifically with convolutional neural net, in the moment when convolution happens. Convolution is a way of sort of compressing or kind of taking two functions and making it into a third one. So instead of two things, you have one. And that one thing is going to be like condensed information. And you don't really know what the other stuff is. You could probably extract it back to what it was with some other process. But the point is that you end up with a smaller amount of data that you need to check. That's how you sort of combine features from the face into these smaller thingies that can then be used to sort of classify something, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Now, whether these things are high resolution or whether they are from people of a particular race or with a particular skin color or whatever, that stuff disappears in the process as such. Yeah. It's combined together with other things and then used in the process of classification. Now, the kind of problem I think you're describing is a problem of the sample itself, right? So if you have a sample of, say, that you use to train your model, that includes people of just a particular skin color, right? That it means that the network or the classifier is going to be sensitive or good at distinguishing in the variance among a class of things that people of a particular skin color have, and really bad at others, because it's just going to say, okay, that's the something else, and I don't know what that is. I'm not really finding. Yeah, exactly. That's exactly right. Now, as an explanation for why it is that, for example, you can train a convolutional neural net or a deep learning model to distinguish between people that are homosexual or not. So I kind of am having a hard time understanding what that means exactly and why that happens. But I wouldn't point to something like, you know, because they have more hats on their heads, or because they have a better resolution camera, or they pose in a particular way or something. I don't think it's going to be like that. I think all of these things disappear in the process of in the hidden layers, so to speak, and we don't know what they are actually. But there is something.
Right. Okay. Well, that's worrisome in its own way, I suppose.
Yes, exactly. I think it is worrisome because we actually may not know exactly what that is. And in fact, with the deep learning models in particular, when you have a lot of features, millions of possible things, and axes of variance, this becomes a problem when you want to say, well, why is this person, say, picked out as I don't know, a potential terrorist, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And you don't know. And I think that's a problem for deep learning in general. We want to be able to give an answer to that question, and we sometimes can't.
Right, because if you get this accusation hurled against you and they're just like, well, the AI said so, you're like, okay, well, I don't know
Yeah,
what to
that's
say in
right.
response.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, it's not that it can't be done in principle. I think that there is a tendency among people to think these things are like magic 8 balls that just somehow work. They're not. This is just math. It's just a lot of calculus and linear algebra and numbers.
Like a lot of
And
matrix multiplication, right?
yes, or in the case of convolution, it's integrals, right?
Okay.
So I mean, it's just numbers for them, for these models. They don't know what this is. And when we want an explanation, we don't want numbers and formulas and you know, a matrix or an integral. We want something that has a category, right? We want something like, oh, it's a hat.
Yeah.
Or it's the way that they pose, or it's um, the resolution on their camera. And I don't think that it's ever going to be anything like that. That's
okay.
going to tell you why that person was picked out as, say, a terrorist.
All right, well, I mean, so I guess I'm especially concerned about like both corporate and state use of these technologies and whether these uses are morally and politically defensible. There are several use cases that spring to mind here, like during the pandemic, we saw a lot of use of cameras on people's laptops, as you mentioned earlier, to like check whether children were paying attention when they were learning from home. It like, I guess just aside from AI, this like intrusion of the panopticon into children's homes seems to me objectionable. But then to like make it something that's also part of someone's school record and can be used to judge them makes it seem even worse. I don't know, what do you think about these like off-the-shelf corporate tools that are then employed in state education systems?
Corporations have a fiduciary duty to their shareholders to make money. And okay. And as it turns out, you can make a lot of money by building a panopticon that trawls data and creates profiles of people and uses all this stuff that we're talking about to predict how they will turn out or what they will do. And you know, it's a new kind of economy. But what I think about it, I think that corporations are doing exactly what they're built to do. They increase profits for their their shareholders. Yeah. So I don't think it appeals to how bad corporations may be in this process are going to help. I think this is terrible. Of course, it's astonishing that it's happening. But what were we expecting? They're just there to make money, and this is exactly what they're doing.
So you're just saying this is really not an AI issue. This is a political economy issue.
Absolutely, yes, of course. I mean, it's a little bit like, you know, opiates are addictive. Everyone knows this. For a really long time, we've known this, right? I mean, heroin and so on have been around for a really long time. Put this substance into the hands of a profit-seeking entity, and you know what's going to happen. This isn't particularly hard to predict. You don't need to be an AI. Right? And but now, is this the fault of the opiate? I mean, do we need to do something about the chemical compound? No, of course not. It plays a function. It plays an important function in a lot of ways to mitigate pain and suffering. It's a really important drug to have, and we would not be great if we didn't have it. But put it together with an entity like a pharmaceutical company, and you get what you get. I think that's the same situation with AI, broadly construed.
I mean,
And
so
data.
like, so one way of reading what you just said is that, like, guns don't kill people, people kill people. But I don't think that that's your attitude. You're more saying, like, there are these powerful technologies that can both benefit and harm people, and we need to figure out as a society how best to regulate them. Is that?
Yes, of course. Of course, that's what I'm saying. But I'm being careful because I think there's a deeper point to be made here also. So more or less, people understand how guns work. Guns make holes in things. That's what they do, right? And they shoot these little nuggets of metal and at really high speed, and they're really good at puncturing soft bags like our bodies. There's no mystery there, right? So of course, that's not the case with AI. A lot of people have no idea how this stuff works. And what's worse, I think some people think they know how this stuff works.
Yeah.
Or they're misinformed about what these things are, how they work. And this creates somewhat of a different situation, I think, compared to the guns case. Yeah.
So with guns, it's like there's no magic. People have an idea, like, put metal through human, they die.
Yeah, so the case is pretty clear in some ways, like what to regulate and how you could do it, right? I don't want to enter into some debate about the United States because I don't understand it and what gun legislature, legislation, how it works in the United States. I don't get it. But to abstract away from that, like,
the primary audience
I don't
is
think
Australia, where after there was a massacre in Tasmania, they were like, yeah, we need to get rid of these.
Yeah, of course, which is the logical thing to do, right?
Yeah.
I mean, this is kind of a no-brainer unless you have it in your constitution, as in the United States, that you ought to have a gun. Right? Never mind that it was supposed to be a musket, but like, I mean, that's a straightforward case, right? So there are things that put holes into people. You can buy them in your neighborhood store. Someone bought this thing and killed a whole bunch of others. Yeah, let's just make it harder to get. That's a pretty straightforward thing to do. I don't think that's the same with AI. Yeah,
okay,
it's not straightforward what to do with AI and how to regulate it exactly, and how to limit the bad consequences of things like putting AI into the classroom and so on.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, okay, so this, I guess, brings us to the next question I wanted to ask you. So, like, another example is this use of facial and emotion recognition by police and security agencies, maybe at passport control or other places, subways, whatever it might be. so you've been actually doing like cutting edge research on recognizing emotions and other attitudes in faces. But you're doing this like in the lab or on MTurk or, you know, in with some distance from action. What do you think are the prospects for reasonably deploying this kind of thing with, say, like police body cams? Is there any scenario where this is reasonable, or is the sort of thing where like maybe in a decade we can talk about it again?
Well, are you asking me whether I think this is technologically feasible, or whether it's legal, or whether it's, say, morally problematic? I'm not sure. Sorry.
I guess morally problematic, and that would depend in part on how technologically reliable it is, because if it's not reliable, then it's
I see.
not the sort of thing you should be doing.
So great. Okay, thanks. Yeah, there are domains of use that I think are really good and promising for this kind of technology, and computer scientists that are working on this, that are actually on the cutting edge. I'm not. Okay, but thank you. It was really sweet. But of this kind of work, you know, they find applications in, especially in healthcare, for this kind of stuff. I think
so, like diagnosing depression and anxiety, or?
Well, so there was a colleague that I had in Tilburg, who is now in Utrecht, doing really wonderful work with pain. We're pain monitoring in a hospital of a patient. So sometimes a patient, you know, that may not be able to express or to a nurse. A nurse may not always be there, but if you have an AI powered system that is monitoring the facial expressions of a patient, right? You know when they're in pain, or you may know how much they're suffering and whether it's chronic. That's great. That will increase the quality of life for people in the hospital a lot. I think this is just one example, but of course, I have a colleague also in Tilburg who's been working on using this kind of technology to identify markers of Elizabeth Huistenfeld, who was a roommate of mine, who I'm working with currently on a project, who's using this kind of stuff to identify the kind of arousal or whatever markers that precede people passing out when they have needle fear.
Oh.
And when they're about to give blood or something, right? So you can have an intervention right there, or stop the procedure before they pass out. There's a lot of stuff like this. I mean, I'm just kind of picking up things that are really close to home for me. Is it feasible? Yes. There are people doing this research right now. Is it accurate? Pretty accurate, yes. And I don't mean pretty accurate meaning above chance. This isn't, you know, this isn't psychology. This is I'm like 90+%. 90+%. Sorry, that was perhaps uncalled for. It's pretty good. Yeah, 90+%. And you can also pay attention or tune your systems to, for example, care more about whether the true positives or the false positives, right, or so you can kind of make sure that you protect, say, in a given situation, the person.
Yeah.
Right? Is it a big deal if in a situation in a hospital where someone is in chronic pain, the AI system 1 out of 10 times tells you that they are in pain when they're not? Not so much, right?
Well, I mean,
You're
if you're
just going to
dosing
pay.
them with morphine, then it could be.
That may be a problem, indeed.
Right.
Yeah. So you should pay attention to these things, right? And I think the way that you design the system and what kind of checks and balances you put into it should be sensitive to that.
Right.
And I think this is exactly the kind of work that people like us, people with a philosophical training, and that can spot the normative issues that have come in and say, well, look, well, what if it's giving too much morphine without without the patient's consent? How problematic is this? Let's take this up to the ethics committee. I
Yeah.
think that's exactly right. And it's not something that an engineer should ever care about on their own.
No, they just don't have training in that. I mean, it's not like
No,
they're
exactly.
bad people.
Exactly
It's
right.
just that that's not what they have expertise in. Yeah, I mean, the one time I got morphine, I have to tell you, I asked for a lot of it.
Again, let me ask you, are you sure you want to be recording this?
It's entirely legal. I had my appendix out. They gave me a button that I could push to get more morphine, and I'm pretty sure that it didn't work most of the time. Yeah, I mean, so hospitals are aware of this kind of stuff. I guess I was more worried about like really split-second decisions. Like, so you may know that the manufacturer of the what do they call those? Not Teslas, the guns that they shoot people with, but they don't kill people every time.
Tasers.
Tasers. They renamed themselves Axon, and they were going to try to sell AI stuff to police departments in the US, including not only identity recognition, but also like aggression recognition based on people's faces and their gait, like how they're moving. And their own ethics board said, like, this is not ready. This is not okay. We can't do this. And they didn't do it, which surprised me a little bit. So I guess this is like a somewhat different use case from the hospital where you've got nurses who are trained to like think about it 3 times and not shoot someone in the face.
So, Mark, let me ask you this. So do you want to have a fight about this? Because we could, I mean, so what you just described, I don't see any, I mean, I see some potential moral problems with this
Yeah.
tech,
Yeah,
but I like it.
you like it. I'm happy to have a fight. Let's throw it down.
I like it. I mean, so and I mean, perhaps not in the United States. I mean, policing in the United States is, complicated.
But that's where this company is based.
So that's why I'm saying perhaps, this is a different issue. But
Okay.
as a technology, I think it's a very interesting and potentially beneficial use of AI. Should a police officer have an indication, independent of their gut feeling, whether the person they're dealing with is going to be aggressive or is aggressive? I would say yes. Perhaps there are special cases where, for a variety of reasons, their biases, their training isn't enough to overcome their fear of the other person, and they overreact. And in fact, I know that sometimes people do that, right?
Yeah. Okay.
If there's an AI that tells them, look, this person is not actually aggressive,
Yeah.
perhaps they won't do anything.
Okay, that's very optimistic. I guess I'm thinking of it more in the US context, just because that's what I know best. And in the US, if the officer has any reason to think that they're in danger, then they're authorized to use lethal force, essentially. So if you introduce yet one more reason why you might feel in danger, even if it's almost always telling you you're not, then that's just creating more hazard for the people that the police interact
But
with.
it's also creating a potential defense for the person that may or may not have been a victim of the police officer overreacting. Right? Let's say the police officer is going to, do something, draw a gun, shoot, whatever, use a taser, even though they were informed by their AI-powered system that this person isn't aggressive. In the court of law, then that can be used as evidence,
Right.
I would think. Right? Why did you overwrite this? Even though you have independent evidence, and it's not anymore just a question of their mental state, right? They're being given advice about the situation that is independent of their mental state, which we all know, like retroactively, is near impossible to sort of prove otherwise. Like what I was afraid at the time for my life, they will say. And how can we prove that that was not the case? The only way I would think that we have any chance of saying, well, you should have acted otherwise, because there was an independent piece of information that was telling you, hey, you shouldn't be drawing your gun. This guy's right.
So the idea is that if you had a sufficiently cautious AI,
Correct.
then you could actually potentially at least discourage police shootings.
Or give potential victims a recourse in a court of law that they wouldn't have otherwise. I think this is exactly the sort of issue and the sort of conversation that philosophers and ethicists and legal scholars ought to be having with the engineers about how to design these things, right? Because then, for example, you don't want this particular piece of technology to be overreactive.
Yeah.
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 Right. You want it to be very conservative about what it does, and also be sensitive to a lot of things, like, for example, fact that, and this is a fact that I recently was made aware of, people with antisocial personalities, they're not very good at expressing their emotions.
Right.
Okay. And this includes the face. They don't move their face much.
Oh, interesting.
So now get a psychologist, get a cognitive scientist involved, right? You can make this AI even better. So it isn't just, just throw a whole bunch of pictures in there of all kinds of people, and magic will happen. No, it has to be a specific kind of a system that is going to be sensitive to a specific kind of people, perhaps. Unfortunately, we'll need to do a little bit of profiling, right?
Yeah.
But then, if it's conservative enough, it might actually prevent police violence. That's how I would think.
That's interesting. I mean, I don't think I'm convinced yet, but this is the only argument I've ever heard that made me question my conclusion about this. So that's helpful.
Thanks.
If you don't mind, I want to move on to some even more fraught cases. In particular, regimes that are more authoritarian than the United States. I'm thinking like the use of facial and ethnic recognition in mainland China to target Uyghur minorities there. As I understand, at least from the Western press, this has been ramped up quite a bit recently. What do you think of the prospects for this kind of technology? I mean, like, is it just picking up on, I guess you kind of said you don't think so, but is it picking up on the clothes and the makeup and the gait that people have, or is this actually picking up on something that people can't modify about themselves and therefore don't have a way to defend themselves against?
I think the latter. Yeah. I mean, um, so I was born in Poland, and I consider myself an American as well as a European. And for a very long time, I had this ability to, or I thought this kind of a trick I was doing, being able to tell or guess the nationality of a European. And it's pretty good at it. Right? The basis for these guesses, I could, speculate about, eyes and faces, etc. To someone that hasn't been so embedded in Europe, this is probably a really hard thing to do. And in fact, my wife, when she first came to Europe 7 years ago or 8, she couldn't do this, and was always impressed that I could do this and guess someone's nationality and say, "Oh, that's a Swede," or
So
"No,
not
that's a
just based
Pole."
on how they talked, but just how they
Yes,
looked.
just the way they looked, right? This is just some anecdotal stuff, right? But here's what happened. She could do pretty good right now. We do the same thing, right? And oh yes, that's a Pole. There's some things about Poles you could tell pretty clearly, yeah, or someone that's a Slav in general. How they're different from Germans, the way that they look, and these are common kind of groups of features of the face that include things like, I think, the size of the nose bridge, the lips, relationships between eyes, how deeply set they are. These aren't things
It's not like
skin
race
color.
science where it's like there's Africans
No.
and Europeans and Asians. It's much
No,
more.
I mean, I think it's a lot more fine grained, and it's and these are common features. These aren't like defining features, right? So how this happens exactly, I can't tell you. I can speculate about what these things are, but my guesses are, probably not great. I think that an AI does more or less something like that. It picks up on these features in the same way in which we have, and then it gets really good at it. And these are features of the face. These aren't things like the fact that, Poles wear more polo shirts than, ties or something. I don't think that's the case. If anything, it's probably something more to do with the fact that I know Poles have these things. Right? If you look at my hair,
The widow's peak.
widow's peak.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's not common across all Europeans. So, yeah, that's what I think the prospect for that kind of a technology are, and I think it really matters how you do your sample, right? If you pick out a group of people from a particular place, it doesn't have to be Poles, it doesn't have to be Uyghurs or Americans or whatever. There'll be something that they have in common. And if you train your model with them, that model will represent it. right? And that thing that they have in common, whatever it is going to be different from some other group. If that's what the Chinese did, and I'm assuming that's what they did with the Uyghurs and the Han. They can do it with a lot of other people as well.
Yeah, I guess this has to do as well with like the way in which data gets labeled, right? Because
Yes.
you could say we've got an ethnicity classifier, or you could say we have a potential criminal classifier, and you can slap the same label on
Yes.
the same category, depending on your purposes, right? And that's essentially what's going on in mainland China right now.
Okay, yeah, I mean, I think that's a wonderful point about labels, right? Uyghurs. I mean, who knows what, pick out all the prison the population in the United States, right? And do the same thing to identify criminals.
Yeah, it's going to go really badly.
It's going to go really badly, but I'm sure that there's some feature. I'm sure that there's some number of features, and they're not going to be these high-level features that we're thinking of. They're going to identify really well what they all have in common. That's how these things work. That's how deep learning works. Now, of course, it's going to be hard for us not to notice, for example, that what our AI is doing is is telling us that the average or the criminal in the United States is of a particular skin color. Well, that's just a feature of the sample.
Right. I mean, this is something that we've known from criminology and sociology
exactly
for decades, right? But I guess the worry I have is that if the training data is messed up in that kind of way, then people can end up concluding that they've got some kind of objective perspective on things, when in fact what they're doing is reproducing generations of prejudice, essentially.
I agree with you that it's really important for this reason that people don't not think of artificial intelligence and machine learning and deep learning in particular as these magic balls that somehow get things right. I think we really need to understand what these things are doing, how they function, to then not make the kind of mistake that you're talking about. If we understand what these things are telling us, right, we're not going to be, or perhaps we will be more immune to the kinds of claims that you're discussing. Right? Oh, look, I know my AI here tells me what I need to do to prevent crime. I just need to pick out all the people that it tells me are likely to be criminals, right? Anyone with a little bit of understanding of how these models work will know that the first question to ask, well, how did you train your model?
Right. Yes.
And I think that once you do just a little bit of that, I think, raise awareness across the population about these things. We'll see that first of all, this isn't magic. This isn't some like science fiction stuff. This is just a lot of math, and you can interpret the result better.
Yeah. Okay. So I guess the last thing I want to kind of explore with you, if you have the time, is what's going on in Ukraine.
For you, always, Mark.
Thank you. But yeah, what's going on in Ukraine right now? So I mentioned Clearview AI already. It's this American company that's been very controversial. They've been fined by the UK government, in part based on evidence provided by the Australian government. Massive privacy violations. But setting that aside, they've essentially offered their services, as I understand, for free to the Ukrainian government to help them identify deceased Russian soldiers, and then enable them to contact those soldiers' next of kin and tell them, hey, your boy is dead. Which, on the one hand, I guess if your son is dead, you probably want to know, but on the other hand, you probably don't want it coming from this particular source. There is a kind of central international agency that does this through the United Nations. And as I understand it, like Ukraine is using, they're using like social media posts to do this. So I guess like from a technological point of view, on the first hand, and on the one hand, like, why not just use dog tags or other official ID? Like what is the motivation here, if you have any clue what's going on?
It's an interesting question to ask to a Ukrainian, preferably in the armed forces of Ukraine, not necessarily me, but
they might not be as forthcoming.
They might not be as forthcoming about it. I could speculate about this if you want me to do that.
Yeah, I mean, if you
my
feel like you have informed speculation, I think that would be useful.
Sure. I mean, so I think this kind of technology is not particularly militarily useful in this particular way, as you're just describing it, right? So to identify dead soldiers. I don't think like there's a lot to be gained by doing, to do that. That's just how it appears to me. But I think in the context of the conflict there, it definitely will play, I would think, an important role for Ukrainians to maybe I'll just say this. I think it's not particularly controversial that Russian armed forces haven't always been good at informing next of kin about casualties on the front. And I think that this isn't, I don't think anyone can say that I'm wrong about that, even though I'm not a military expert. I mean, this was the case in Afghanistan, it was the case in Chechnya, and probably also in World War II. So that at the same time, I think from what I'm hearing on the news and what I know from people that have been following the conflict, people in Russia seem to be relatively, what I mean Russia, I mean people in Moscow, people that live in central Russia, have been relatively unaffected by what's going on in Ukraine. Meaning, as far as their immediate family being hurt or so on. These are people from poorer parts of Russia, the Russian Federation, that have ethnic minorities like the Buryats or whatever. The Russian state probably isn't going to be informing them all the time.
Yeah.
Now, doing what this technology is doing, I would think, is a way of kind of informing the families, not only by, sending dog tags, which you could have, made yourself or found on the street, showing something. And I think that this is meant to not only be a kind of I don't know, like a service, but also a way of creating impact on the ground among the population of Russia about the impact that this has on them. They are dying there. I don't know what the official figures for this operation are for in the Russian media, but my suspicion is that they're lower than they actually are. Right? This is going great.
A couple of orders of magnitude, yeah.
Right. Well, that's exactly what was happening in Afghanistan for a while until it wasn't, right? And until it wasn't, and people in the Soviet Union realized, oh, perhaps they've been lying to us about this. And I think that there's some element of that in the use of this technology in Ukraine. But that's definitely not how the Russian military probably would like to use technology like this if it had it. I mean, it's a relatively minor kind of thing and a long shot that will make a difference.
You mean Ukrainian?
Yeah, I mean, it's a long shot that this will matter, right? It's a long shot that if we identify enough dead soldiers, dead Russian soldiers in Ukraine, this will make a difference to I don't know, make them pull out or make people upset about the war. My God, they're lying to us about how many of our sons and brothers are dying. I don't know. So,
yeah. I mean, so I guess I don't know this up close at all, but like when I was reading about this, I was like, so we know that these technologies work best on faces of living people. We know that they work better for white faces than faces of people with more skin pigmentation. We know that the Russians are throwing ethnic minorities into battle at a much higher rate. So it just seems like there's a high likelihood of false positives and false negatives. And like, do you really want to torment some family by saying like, we killed your son when you didn't? Or, the other way around, when, people maybe start to think like, well, we can't trust the Russian state, but maybe the Ukrainians will tell us whether our boy is dead, and you don't hear, so you assume he's still alive, but he's not because the AI didn't work. Like, I guess deploying this kind of technology from an American for-profit organization in the midst of a war without any kind of oversight just seems to me kind of crazy.
Yeah, I think it's irresponsible. I think you're right about that. I think it's a highly irresponsible thing to do. I would push back on a couple of the claims you made. Nonetheless, I think that, it all depends on how this thing was trained. Like, it's not necessarily that, facial recognition models are going to be really bad at picking out minorities or it depends on how you train it. If you're going to train it on, as you described it, on Russian social media, I assume that Russian social media doesn't include only people that are that have a particular skin color and look like Slavs. It's very diverse.
It's diverse, but it's
as the
gonna
Russian Federation.
It's gonna oversample people with better information technology, right?
Fair enough.
Yeah.
I mean, no, this is completely irresponsible. I think that I don't understand what their thinking was here. It sounds like this may be some kind of a not very well thought out attempt to help out or help the Ukrainians in some way, maybe in this way that I mentioned earlier, namely, look, you can identify these soldiers and let their family know that they're actually dying or that they're dead. I would think that probably what's going on here is that this is technology that has dual use. This isn't
Yeah,
actually
yeah.
what it's used for.
I think that's probably what's going on. I mean, Clearview has had so much bad press that they probably just thought, we can do something for Ukraine and we'll look good. And then
Yeah.
the Ukrainians were like, you know, we're getting 1,000 war crimes committed against us every day. So what's the harm in this? And I just want to make it clear, like, you know, like, it's really clear who the aggressors and the main criminals
Yeah,
are.
I mean, of course. I mean, but we're talking about the technology, and I think that, you know, yeah, on the one hand, this is how the technology is portrayed in by Clearview, as, you know, that's what its purpose is. But I think from the perspective of the Ukrainians on the ground that may or may not be fighting, these the Russian soldiers, I don't see them thinking this is something they would like take the time to do. Like, I mean, there are better ways of using this if you're a soldier at war than to, like, you know, troll somebody's mom. There are bombs flying, people are dying, your friends are dying, right? A village is burning, and you're trolling someone's mom. Like, I mean, I understand there's probably some emotional reason to do this, but as you said, if you already have the dog tags and you can identify who their family are, you don't need AI to do anything. You'll just find them on Facebook.
Yeah.
So my suspicion is that this is technology that probably has a secondary use in the conflict.
So do you imagine, I mean, so this is all speculation at this point, and would close up soon, but you imagine this sort of stuff is going to end up being used for identifying like high value targets rather than just
100%. That's exactly what I think. Yes, high value targets, spies, collaborators. That's exactly this isn't, you know, a boon for military intelligence. If you can identify who amongst your troop or the people in a village is actually, you know, a member of the Russian armed forces.
Right. So I guess this takes us back to the question I was asking before, like, so you train this classifier and it shows you, say, whether someone is ethnically Russian, they're trying to cross a checkpoint as a refugee. It says, it doesn't say Russian, it says spy, right? Same classifier, different label. Like all of a sudden, the consequences for this person could be very, very different.
Yes, and that's why you need an ethicist to make sure that this doesn't happen. I mean, yes, because you can't do that, and it would be wrong. And it would be wrong. And it's a very small, tiny little change that's super easy to do.
Yeah.
Yeah. And we need regulation about this. We need explicit, ratified international treaties that tell you how this is done. We probably need an oversight from independent bodies that hire people like you and me to work in and sort of point these issues out. Yes, this is what needs to happen, because this is not like guns, right? Where you know exactly what this thing is doing and what the problem is. The problem is that someone put a hole in someone else.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, we don't even have those organizations yet, so there's a lot to look forward to.
Well, if we make it that far, I mean, you know, there are bigger issues, bigger fish to fry, as they say, right? Like, then, not that these are small or insignificant issues, but, you know, my wish would be that before we have oversight over things like our, you know, AI that can accurately classify faces and mental states from facial expressions, we get more funding and more institutions in charge of climate change. I think that's the thing that we ought to be paying a little bit more attention to. And however much I'm of course fascinated and love the work in AI, and I love all of this attention and hype. In some ways it's annoying, but in some ways it's also great. It's kind of cool, right? There's a little bit of guilt that comes from that. And that
no,
kind
fair
of wish that hype and that attention was pointing at very real imminent catastrophes happening around the, all over the place that have to do with that. And but AI is and can be used to help with that as well. And I think that we'll see those kind of tools soon.
Well, frost.
Use satellite imaging, for example, to identify places where there's deforestation. You can use the same convolutional neural network technologies to spot fires, to spot illegal toxic dumps, to monitor ice cap melting, etc. So
one problem at a time. Thank you so much for your time.
You're welcome, Mark. Thanks for having me. This was a lot of fun.
Stop the recording.